I'm Croatian, raised in Croatian community. And even though we were bombarded with Western media, specifically the English-speaking one, still, if someone threw me into the education system expecting that I'm able to follow everything in English rather than my own native language, I think at that point I would probably not be great in education, neither would I be here right now debating. What I'm going to do in my speech is first, I'm going to be talking about the model. Then I will be generally explaining why uh, putting Arabic into the schools as a primary language of instruction is something that is going to lead to the better education for the children of these communities. First, in terms of the framing, primary language doesn't mean the only language. I think it's simply logical to think that French will be taught as well, probably as a second language. I believe that given that we're talking about France as a country, there is a certain level of probability that it's going to be more intense than your average second language that you're actively learning. But also, I would say that on a probability, this education of French is likely to be done well because certain goals of the integration of possibly having better educated workforce or the workforce that has capacity to work within the state is probably something that is in the interest of France rather than to be stuck on their welfare system. Additional thing, I believe that this motion primarily applies to the elementary and middle school, meaning that first, eighth grades are likely to be captured by this motion. Know that these are usually the schools that people usually go to in these particular districts, meaning that when you're attending high school or particular vocational school, you're probably going to different parts of the town. So it's not necessarily something that is connected to the area itself like we have in the motion. All right, why this will be better for children as education? I think that first thing in terms of this argument that we need to realize is the characterization on how these children are being raised. Already in the info slide, we can get the information that their community predominantly and their families speak Arabic. This is done for a couple of reasons. First, often, even if you are second generation immigrant, you were raised by the parents whose primary language was Arabic. There is additional connection uniquely for the Arabic that is connected to the religion of Islam itself. Know that this is the notation that vast majority of these people believe if we worship the God in Arabic, we're worshiping the God in the correct way. This is why Quran is being consumed in the status quo in Arabic, etc. So besides of the cultural connection, besides of the previous past experiences and part of the identity of the parents being the Arabic, there's also this additional idea that this is the language that makes us closer to God, meaning that the high probability of the children not being taught French in the first place is something that simply is the case. Know that this is not only connected to the info slide, but also connected to the restrictions that you generally do have. So the only exposure that you're likely to get to French inside of your own community is likely to be broken French or certain Arabic words being substituted with French words, but mostly still these communities speaking Arabic. Meaning that the exposure and the understanding to the French language that you as a child have before you're entering your educational journey is probably likely to be very limited. What are the harms that we're generally getting from that? We're getting the harms that kids are not facing great education as they could have. Note that the specific difference that you're having if you have Arabic language being implemented as primary instructory language, you're likely to have greater understanding from the side of those kids. Note that the vocabulary that we might face, even if we face certain French words in our community, is likely to be connected to the communication basis, meaning that it's very hard for us to have huge vocabulary that we can really appreciate and understand everything perhaps that professors are saying to us when we're pursuing this sort of education, or that we can actively look into the textbooks when we're trying to educate ourselves or do some work on our own. So these are the skills, two skills of you being understand fully the subjects and the contents that are being presented to you, and that you're able to pursue education on your own, meaning the usage of the textbooks in the best way possible for you to be able to understand them is something that is in the status quo, extremely limited at a point of which you don't know French. And know that just throwing these children into the water for them to learn to swim, for them to simply understand French, isn't necessarily how it works, because education system is something that develops from each grade that you're getting hired to, meaning that if you're not able to capture the basis understanding, it's even harder for you to actively catch up later in life. While in a comparative, if you're able to understand the basis of it, it's easier for you to pursue the contents in the higher grades. While on the other hand, the learning of French is something that ends up being simply on site, simply something that is being developed in its own, not necessarily making the other subjects dependent on it. This means that the education and how you're able to pursue it as a student is something that is far better. But note that there's the additional thing of your parents even being able to help you with the education. If they have their own limitations with the French, this is also something that prevents them from actively being able to help you. Know that these communities probably are not as privileged to be able to pay for tutors and all of that. So community help or family help is something that these students have to rely on. Know that besides of removing these tangible obstacles that the children are currently facing in terms of the education, you're also removing the psychological effects that are causing demotivation in the status quo. If you're stuttering or you're facing these obstacles in the first place from the first grade, this is something that initially eliminates the possibility of education for you as a child and creates this general greater picture which is quite negative for you on how do you perceive the education in the first place, which is extremely harmful for you to be able to pursue other opportunities later in life. With the ability to educate themselves better, to understand the contents better, these children are becoming more competitive, meaning that the ability for you to attend the vocational school or go to the better high school or maybe even attend the university in the end when you're older is something that is completely unlocked at the point at which you're able to engage with the education in the first place. So this is why we should definitely um, we should definitely um, promote this motion.
I think the information slide itself proves why the use of Arabic as the primary language of instructions in schools in districts dominated by the Arabic community is unnecessary. Arabic is frequently spoken at home and in the community, which means that their cultural attachment to the language will not die. In fact, even in schools, Arabic can still be taught as a second or elective language, right? The debate is about being the primary language of instruction in schools, and it's clearly French that should be considered as one, especially if we're talking about the future of the students. The first thing that I'll argue is on social cohesion and why it is crucial for people within the community to integrate more effectively with the rest of the population. The primary language of instruction in schools is French. It is important to note that France is a nation where citizens come from diverse backgrounds. So aside from the Arabic community, France has also large communities from sub-Saharan African nations like Mali, for example, like Senegal and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is also due to historical ties and labor migration, right? Turkish and Lebanese communities were also formed for the same reason. Because of this diversity, the French Republic promotes that public life, including education, should be centered around the French identity and language for several reasons. First, language is a powerful tool for unifying a nation, right? Simply having a common language ensures that people can communicate, they can work together and participate fully in society. If different districts, therefore, such as the Arabic community, adopt different primary languages of instruction, it could create divisions within the country, just like what happened in Belgium and Canada, where language divided communities, right? This is also the reason why France enforces assimilation policies that require immigrants to learn French and integrate into French culture, because some community-led schools promoting Arabic threatens the ability of students to integrate in the future as well. Second, this is in line with the goal of schools and the responsibility of the government to ensure equal opportunities for everyone. If the primary language of instruction of these communities is French, and students are actually used to speaking French because they are the primary language of instruction, it will be easier for them to penetrate the French job market, for example, whose best selling point is to be proficient proficient in French to begin with, as opposed to when students are primarily taught in Arabic, they might struggle later in life when they need to compete for jobs and university placements and other opportunities that require strong French skills. And if even in the French Constitution, it is a legal requirement for public institutions like schools to use French as the primary language, a French medium education for Arabic communities ensures that all students have an equal chance of succeeding within the national framework. What does this imply exactly? These students are mostly going to stay in France anywhere when they grow up and after college, right? And in order for them to thrive and survive, they need to be able to have a sense of belonging and be able to effectively integrate with the rest of society. And if at their homes, the interest of their parents is to ensure that they keep their culture and traditions of the Arabic community, the only institution that can help them do that is their school, and schools have to be aligned with the general interest of the nation if they want to ensure that every individual has to be able or has the ability to integrate in the society, which is why it is ultimately better if French is the primary language of instruction in schools within the Arabic communities. What this argument proves is that there's just more benefits to the students, most especially because French as the primary language of instruction does not eliminate the chance of the students to know more about the Arabic culture and language. The second thing I'll argue is why this reduces the likelihood of radicalization from the community. Isolation enables radicalization, and isolation happens when students grow up primarily interacting with people from their own background and limits their ability to integrate with the broader French society, right? This creation of parallel societies can also be seen in Belgium and Canada, where language differences have contributed to long-standing divisions, right? And speaking of parallel, some European countries tried to prevent these divisions as well from happening. When German and UK authorities, for example, had to shut down Arabic language schools for the reasons that France should consider, right? First is on preventing extremism, especially because linguistic and cultural isolation created conditions where radical ideologies take root. And at second, French public schools follow a strict national curriculum, right? And it's just basically ensuring that all students receive secular and balanced education. Therefore, if Arabic were the primary language in some districts, there could be a rise in unregulated private schools that might not align with the secular values of France. And France is very firm on that. And since Arabic is closely tied to Islamic culture, making it the primary language of instruction in some districts could be seen as a violation of these secular principles, right? And thus is the creation of precedent. If France allows Arabic to be a primary language of instruction in some districts, it could set a precedent for other communities like the Turkish community or Portuguese communities to demand the same, which would undermine France's commitment to a singular and or single national identity. What does this essentially mean for the debate? This means that the more you allow these communities to not practice the values of the French national identity, the more they will have incentive to radicalize, as opposed to making them feel like there is something to connect to French communities together and that they can form social cohesion through one national language. What is the tieback? The way students grow depends on how they are raised, and the values that they bring, or like the values they bring as they grow up, or the values that they learn when they are young, right? So if you teach them to isolate, they will grow isolated from society. And even if it's not the intention, it's very likely that they will still be isolated because of the misaligned values and principles within the general society. The idea that the national language is taught and used as the primary language of instruction to these children sends a message that they are part of the nation and that they have a responsibility to the nation, preventing them from resentment, preventing them from retaliation, and preventing them from further radicalization. What this speech has proven are two things. Firstly, we're able to prove to you why students have the more ability to integrate within the society and therefore fosters better belongingness with the students and giving them more and equal opportunities in the future. But secondly, we're able to prove to you why it's very unlikely for these communities to radicalize in the future when they feel like they have a responsibility to the nation because of this responsibility that they have a national identity to uphold to begin with all of these reasons and more propose.